In this video, I'm going to do a teardown of a Sony Vaio UX. I'll show how to replace both the factory SSD or mechanical hard drive with a modern flash alternative. I'll then give some tips on installing Windows and finding the appropriate Vaio drivers. And then finally, I'll give a quick tour of the computer. So let's start out with the history and specs. First released in 2006 with both Japanese and American models. Most came with Intel U1000 series Core Solo processors. These are single core processors ranging from 1 GHz to 1.33 GHz. Some of the very final models came with an Intel Core 2 Solo U2000 series at 1.2 GHz, with the main benefit being 64-bit support, although with the low memory, you're still better off running 32-bit operating systems in most cases. There were some 933 MHz Celerons also released in Japan. For the display, you got a tiny little 4.5-inch 1024 by 600 touchscreen with a stylus. Base models came with 512 megabytes of RAM. You can also get models with 1 gigabyte. This wasn't expandable. For storage, you got a 1.8-inch ZIF hard drive starting at either a 30 gigabyte mechanical drive, or this was also one of the first PCs to offer a factory SSD up to 64 gigabytes. And for operating system, early models came with XP before later switching to Vista. I've read that a lot of people downloaded Vista to XP to get better performance. So now let's take a look at the PC itself. You can see we have a hardware Wi-Fi toggle button. Upper right, our little touchpad mouse pointer. Along the bottom, our 16-volt DC jack, our dock connector, our headphone, and our mic jack. Side, we have a USB port. Underneath this little door here is our compact flash reader. Then along the top, we have a capture button for the camera, memory stick card reader, and a macro button for the camera. Just our battery here. We have our flip-up antenna for edge wireless. This antenna also pops off. Collapsible stylus for the touchscreen. Here's our removable battery. This is the standard battery that fits flush. Little 2-cell battery, 7.4 volts. They also made an extended battery with 4 cells, double the capacity. It's a fair amount larger than the regular battery. See the comparison here? This will stick out a ways. And flipping it over, we have a fingerprint reader in the upper left, as well as a webcam. There's also a webcam on the back. We have the cool slide up screen, revealing a little backlit membrane keyboard. Virtually no feedback on these keys. Let's take a look at the dock. It's got 16-volt DC pass-through, an Ethernet port, 3 USB ports, S400 FireWire port, VGA out, 3.5mm video audio out. Now I was playing around with this, I noticed this little spring-loaded tray, which my other dock didn't have. This dock came with my Japanese UX, and it's a Sony Felicia, which is a contactless RFID smart card reader. It's mainly used for like electronic money cards in Japan. Here I am trying to awkwardly connect it to the dock here. It's at a bad angle. Now if you're missing the clear plastic tray that kind of aligns this with the port, there is a replacement 3D printed mount that you can use in its place. And finally, I'll show off this little kickstand accessory, which seems to be somewhat uncommon. It has a couple different angles you can set it at. Someone's also made a 3D printable version of this. It slides into the same little slots that the dock would use. And you can now stand up your Vaio anywhere. And now starting the disassembly, first we remove the battery and then the stylus. So we'll have 6 screws to remove to pull the back cover off. The first one, the small one, was hidden underneath the battery. We have 4 longer screws in each of the corners here. And we have a final screw hidden underneath this little door. You have to be careful opening this so you don't break off the little tabs. You just want to gently pry up so it unlatches, but it doesn't swing open a full 90 degrees. You instead kind of wiggle it out to the side to reveal the screw. And then we can pull the back cover off. Now there's a wire running from the cellular antenna down to the bottom right. The wire is taped into a channel and it's going to be very tight, like you can see here. It'll probably pull out of the channel. If it doesn't, you probably want to remove it. Otherwise, there's really no slack to set the cover aside. And we can see our factory SSD here with this foil covering, the ZIF cable. It's screwed into the bracket with 3 screws. Now if you had the factory hard drive, this bracket is a little different. I'll show that here. Where rather than the drive screwing into it, the drive is more held captive with this sitting over the top. It requires a bit more disassembly to get the drive out, and I'll show that shortly on another VAIO. So first we need to disconnect the old drive, this ZIF socket here. We just lift up the little arm 90 degrees towards the cable to release it, and then there's the 3 screws. So for a replacement drive, we can either go compact flash based or SSD based. I have a separate video that looks at a lot of different flash options. Here's a compact flash ZIF adapter. You can see it's the same form factor as the original SSD, although not all of the screw holes line up, but enough to hold it in securely. To reconnect it, we lift the little ZIF lever up, slide in the cable, and push it down flat to lock it in. Now an issue with a lot of these adapters is they're made to hold thicker cables. So even though you push it in and you lock it down, just give it the slightest little tug, it'll fall out again like this. But you can fix this by using some capped on tape, which is non-conductive, to make it a little thicker. You put it on the top of the cable, not the bottom here where those connectors are. Now for my install, I actually didn't use a compact flash adapter. The couple of industrial compact flash cards I have, fairly small for Windows, especially if I want a dual boot. I have this big fast SanDisk standard card, but the Sony UX BIOS doesn't seem to detect any of my standard cards. So I'm going to instead go with this, which I picked up on eBay. It's ZIF and came with the 128GB M2 SATA drive. One thing that wasn't immediately clear, even though the connector looks the same, the contacts are on the other side. So you actually have to put this in upside down. So we insert the cable, push the little locking lever back down flat towards the drive, and mine held securely without needing any Kapton tape. So obviously this is a smaller drive than the original. Also the factory bracket didn't have a screw in the lower right corner, so we're only going to be able to catch one screw. I think that should be fine to keep it in place, so I won't use any double-sided tape. You can see here I was considering it, but I didn't really want to put tape on the top of this chip since there's some airflow in here. I don't know how warm it gets. Overall, I'm happy with this. The other corner kind of catches underneath the metal tab to hold it in place. And since we're no longer using the far mounting holes, I just put the screws back in so they don't get lost. Now before I start the reassembly, let me show you how you'd replace the factory spinning hard drive that this second VAIO has, since it's a bit more involved. So first, we need to remove the white and gray antenna cables off the Wi-Fi adapter. A plastic spudger can help with this. Next, remove the Wi-Fi card. There's a single screw in the corner holding it down. You may also have to peel back some of the tape. We have an Intel 3945 ABG card. And then we have 5 screws holding in the bracket. We lift up the little ZIF connector 90 degrees straight up towards the ribbon cable. And then we pry out the old drive. It's kind of wedged in here with the rubber bumpers attached to the sides. Now just to see how things would fit, if we were to use the compact flash adapter, it sits pretty well under the ledges. Remember, we want to use some Kapton tape here. Maybe use a dot of hot glue or something to keep it from wiggling around, but I think it should be held fairly captive here. And finally, trying out to fit on that short ZIF SSD. Now, if I was permanently installing this, I would maybe consider putting some masking tape or a label on the bottom of this board here just to make sure that nothing can make contact with that metal shielding above it. Again, I'd maybe use a dot of hot glue, but otherwise it looks like this should fit without issues as well. And now for the final reassembly. You're not really going to be able to tuck this antenna cable back into the channel where it was, put it together, but just kind of keep an eye on it, make sure it doesn't pinch, and it should be fine. So this little bottom door is tricky again. You don't want to risk breaking off the tabs. So you have it almost flush, kind of hook the tabs, and then push the front down to lock it. So now let's plug it in, turn it on, go into the BIOS, make sure our new drive has been detected. Hitting function F2. We have our Vaio UX 92NS, 1 GB of RAM, and it's found our 128 GB SSD. I had a dual boot setup here, imaged over from the old drive. Looks like it's working fine. So now let's talk about installing an operating system. Early Sony Vaio UXs came with Windows XP, and then later on they started coming with Vista. A lot of people rolled back their Vista installs to XP to run faster. I've personally tried Windows 7 as well, and it runs really well with my 1 GB model. My Vaio didn't come with any recovery media. I didn't seem to be able to find any for my specific Japanese model, but luckily it had a base install and recovery partition, which I'll image and link. VAIOs are kind of notorious for being hard to find their drivers and all their specific apps. So if you need to find a driver disk, you can always check archive.org. Here's another good site, the Vaio library. Let's see what they have for the UX. Let's see what they have. They have quite a few models. These are mostly US models with the 3 digits, the 280, 380. And now another good source to at least get the drivers is this page here. It has an archive from an old forum post from a forum that's now long gone. So we can get it on archive.org. And he's collected all the XP, Vista, and even put together Windows 7 drivers, which never officially came out for the UX. Now, one problem is all the official drivers do a model check, and they'll only install if you're on the exact right model, even though technically the hardware could be exactly the same. There's 2 workarounds. The first didn't work for me, where you basically run the installer. It makes a little model.txt file with your current model. You modify the file and then lock it so the installer can't replace it. Again, this didn't work for me. The solution that did work for me was to download this universal extractor for Windows, which can basically unpack a bunch of installation tools. If I recall, Sony's using the Wise installer. The model check is part of that installer wrapper, but if you unpack the installer and get to the raw setup files, you can just run them directly and bypass the check. And just as a final note, I did try installing Windows 10 just for the fun of it. Even though my UX is one of the very final models with the best processor and the most RAM on a fast SSD, still is really slow. The installation kind of timed out a couple times during setup. I think Windows 7 is kind of the sweet spot, so I dual boot mine with an English copy of Windows 7 and then the original factory Japanese Vista Business install. Now let's take a quick tour of my Sony Vaio UX. We'll check out what some of the hardware buttons do and some of the included software. I have a dual boot with the factory Vista Business Japanese install and also an English Windows 7. We'll check out Vista since that's where all the factory apps are. So to start out, on the right here, we have our little track point. Move our mouse cursor. Then on the left, we have our left mouse click and our right mouse click. Below the track point, we have a zoom in and zoom out button. This is a digital zoom. Makes it easier to see things on this tiny little screen. We can zoom in, scroll around. Now on the left, below the left and right mouse click buttons, you have a center button. If you click and hold that, you can then use the wheel to scroll around. Checking out the start menu and all the installed programs. I really didn't see anything too interesting. Now directly below the middle click button, there's another button to bring up a little kind of quick launch menu with basic settings for volume, brightness, Bluetooth settings, switching external monitor mode, rotating the device. Then we'll finish up by looking at the one program I found that did look kind of interesting. It's like a brain training program by Sega Toys with math problems, some tutorials and training videos. Kind of fumble around, not really sure what to do, but you'll get the idea. And that's it. Thanks for watching.